1872, Austria. The mother who buried her children alive to save their souls. The Weissenberg Rituals, October 1872. Weissenberg, Austria. The morning mist rolled down from the Austrian hills like the breath of ghosts, settling thick and gray over the estate that bore the family name. Maria Weissenberg knelt in her garden, her black dress spread around her like spilled ink on the damp earth. Her hands worked slowly through the soil, turning it over and over, as if she could find answers buried beneath the surface. 7 small mounds rose from the ground before her. Not graves, not yet, but something that made the village women cross themselves when they passed the iron gates. The holes were perfectly sized, perfectly spaced, each one measuring the length of a child's body. Maria had dug them herself, night after night, when sleep would not come and the voices in her head grew too loud to ignore. The earth clung to her fingers like a promise. Dark soil mixed with something else, something that made her wedding ring slip loose on her thin finger. She had not eaten properly in weeks. Food seemed wrong somehow, when her children needed to be pure, when they needed to be ready. Mama. The voice came from behind her, soft as falling leaves. Little Anna stood at the garden's edge, her golden hair catching what little light filtered through the mist. At 5 years old, she was the youngest, the most innocent, the most ready. Maria did not turn around. She could not let Anna see her face, not when it was wet with tears that felt like betrayal. "Go back inside, my heart," she whispered. "Mama is working. Are you planting flowers?" Anna asked, stepping closer. Her small feet made no sound on the grass. Everything had grown quiet since Papa died. Even the birds seemed to whisper. Something like that. Maria's voice caught in her throat. She pressed her palms flat against the earth, feeling its coolness seep through her skin. Something beautiful, something that will never die. Anna tilted her head, the way children do when they sense the weight of words they cannot understand. "Can I help?" The question hung in the air like the morning mist, thick and heavy. Maria closed her eyes and saw her husband's face. Heinrich, with his gentle hands and his faith that never wavered. He had died in September, taken by a fever that burned through him like fire through paper. The doctor had come from a village, but doctors knew nothing of souls. They knew nothing of salvation. "Not yet, little one," Maria said finally. "Soon." Anna lingered for a moment longer, then drifted back toward the house like smoke. Maria listened to her footsteps fade, then turned back to her work. The holes needed to be perfect, comfortable. She had lined each one with the soft blankets from her children's beds, the ones she had sewn when they were babies, the ones that still smelled like their dreams. The village of Weissenberg sat in a valley that maps would forget within 50 years. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where secrets traveled faster than winter wind. But lately, the secrets had grown too dark to share. The women who used to bring bread and gossip no longer knocked on Maria's door. The men who used to tip their hats when they passed now crossed to the other side of the road. Father Mueller had stopped coming 3 weeks ago. Maria had seen the fear in his eyes when she tried to explain what God had shown her in her dreams. How could she make him understand? The world was full of sin, full of corruption that would steal her children's souls. But there was another way, a better way. Heinrich had shown her in the space between sleeping and waking, when his voice came to her clear and certain as church bells. "The innocent need not suffer," he had whispered. "The pure need not be stained." Maria stood slowly, her knees aching from the cold ground. She was 32 years old, but grief had aged her like winter ages trees, brittle and bent, stripped of everything soft. She brushed the dirt from her dress and walked back toward the house, where her children waited. The Weissenberg estate had been built by Heinrich's grandfather, a man who believed in God and stone walls and keeping the world at a safe distance. 3 stories of gray stone rose against the hillside, with windows that watched the valley like tired eyes. Inside, the rooms echoed with memories of better times. Christmas mornings when laughter filled the halls, summer evenings when Heinrich played violin while the children danced. Now the house held its breath. Maria found her children in the main room, gathered around the great fireplace where no fire burned. 7 faces turned toward her, ranging from Anna's 5 years to Friedrich's 14. They had learned to be quiet since Papa died, learned to move like shadows through the rooms where their mother prayed and wept and whispered to empty air. Elizabeth, 13 years old and too wise for her age, looked up from the book she was pretending to read. "Mama, we're hungry." The word struck Maria like stones. Hungry. Yes, they would be hungry. But food was part of the problem, part of what tied them to this world of suffering and sin. She had been reducing their meals slowly, carefully, the way a gardener prunes a rose bush. A little less each day, to make them light, to make them ready. "I know, my darlings," Maria said, settling into her chair by the cold fireplace. "But remember what we talked about. Remember what Papa told us." The children exchanged glances, the kind of wordless communication that grows between siblings in times of trouble. They remembered. How could they forget? Their mother spoke of Papa's visits every night, of the messages he brought from beyond the grave. Heinrich had been a devout man, a man who read scripture by candlelight and taught his children to pray before every meal. But the Heinrich who visited Maria in her dreams spoke of things that would have made the living man weep. He spoke of shortcuts to heaven, of mercy that looked like cruelty to those who could not see clearly. "Tell us again about the garden," whispered Klaus, age 9, his voice barely audible. He had his father's dark eyes, but lately they seemed to look through things instead of at them. Maria smiled, the first real smile she had worn in days. "The garden is where we will all be together, where there is no pain, no hunger, no fear, where children never grow old and mothers never have to worry." She reached out and touched Klaus's thin cheek. "Where Papa is waiting." Anna climbed on her mother's lap, her small body fitting perfectly against Maria's chest. "Will it hurt?" she asked, the question that had been growing in her heart for weeks. Maria's arms tightened around her youngest child. "Like going to sleep," she whispered into Anna's hair. "Like the softest sleep you've ever had." Outside, the mist was lifting slowly, revealing the mountains that ringed their valley like the walls of a tomb. In the distance, church bells marked the hour, but their sound seemed to come from another world, a world where mothers fed their children and priests offered comfort instead of fear. Maria looked at each of her children's faces, memorizing them as they were now, before the world could touch them with its darkness. Friedrich, trying so hard to be the man of the house. Elizabeth, protecting the younger ones with her fierce love. George, 11 years old and quiet as stone. Margaret, 8, who still believed in fairy tales. Klaus, with his father's eyes. Gretchen, 6, who hummed while she played. And Anna, her baby, her last gift from God. 7 children. 7 chances to choose mercy over cruelty, salvation over corruption. 7 opportunities to show the kind of love that the world would never understand. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily, marking time that had become elastic and strange. Days blended into nights, nights into days, all of it measured now by the rhythm of prayers and the slow, careful work of preparation. Maria had written letters to relatives who would never receive them, had spoken to neighbors who no longer listened. The world outside this house had become an echo, a distant memory of a life she was learning to leave behind. As afternoon shadows began to stretch across the floor, Maria felt a familiar presence settle around her shoulders like a shawl. Heinrich was near, not the Heinrich who had died in fever and pain, but the Heinrich who had found peace beyond the veil of death. He had so much to teach her, so much to show her about the nature of true love. The children felt it too. They always did. Their eyes grew wide and still, and they moved closer to their mother, drawn by an instinct older than fear. They were beginning to understand that the world they had known was ending, and something else, something their mother promised would be better, was about to begin. Outside, the village of Weissenberg prepared for another night, unaware that in the house on the hill, a mother's love was transforming into something that would echo through the mountains long after the last light had gone out. November 1872. The road to Weissenberg, Father Johann Brenner pulled his black coat tighter against the mountain wind as his horse picked its way up the narrow road. At 28, he was younger than most priests sent on such missions, but the church had chosen him for his steady nerves and his way with troubled souls. The letter from Bishop Kessler had been brief. Investigate the reports from Weissenberg, offer guidance where needed, report back within the week. The reports had been whispers at first. Villagers speaking of a widow who no longer brought her children to Mass, of lights burning in the Weissenberg house at all hours, of singing that drifted down from the hills on windless nights. Then came stranger tales, deliveries left untouched at the gate, children seen standing motionless in windows, a mother digging in her garden by moonlight. Father Mueller, the village priest, had written just once before his silence began. His letter spoke of theological questions that kept him awake at night, of conversations that left him questioning everything he thought he knew about mercy and salvation. Then nothing. For 3 weeks, nothing. The house appeared through the mist like a gray wound in the hillside. Father Johann had seen many estate houses in his travels, but this one seemed different, too quiet, too still, as if the very stones were holding their breath. No smoke rose from the chimneys despite the November cold. No children's voices carried on the wind. He dismounted at the iron gate and noticed immediately how the metal had begun to rust, how the drive was overgrown with weeds that should have been cleared weeks ago. The garden that stretched beside the house caught his attention. 7 dark rectangles in the earth, precisely arranged, each one the size of a grave. The front door opened before he could knock. Maria Weissenberg stood in the doorway, and Father Johann felt his prepared words die in his throat. She had been a beautiful woman once. He could see it in the bones of her face, in the way she carried herself despite her thinness. But her eyes held something that made him want to step backward, something that spoke of long nights spent listening to voices only she could hear. "Father," she said, her voice soft as winter rain. "Heinrich said you would come." Heinrich, the dead husband. Father Johann had read the burial records. The man had died 2 months ago, leaving behind a widow and 7 children. But Maria spoke of him as if he had just stepped out of the room. "Mrs. Weissenberg," Johann said carefully, "I've come because we're concerned about you and your family. May I come in?" She stepped aside without a word, and he entered a house that felt more like a tomb. The air was cold despite the closed windows, and everything was too clean, too ordered, as if life itself had been swept away along with the dust. His footsteps echoed on the wooden floors as she led him toward the main room. "Children," Maria called softly. "Come meet Father Johann." They appeared one by one, emerging from doorways and shadows like ghosts taking shape. 7 children, aged from 5 to 14, but all sharing the same look, thin, pale, with eyes that seemed older than their years. They moved with careful grace, as if walking on sacred ground. "This is Anna," Maria said, placing her hands on the shoulders of the youngest child. The little girl looked up at Father Johann with curious blue eyes, but when she smiled, he noticed her teeth were loose, the way they became when a child was not eating enough. "Hello, Father," Anna said in a voice like dried leaves. "Mama says we're going to see Papa soon." The words hit Johann like a physical blow. He looked at Maria, searching her face for some sign that she understood how her daughter's words might sound to others. But Maria only smiled, the kind of smile that belonged in paintings of saints receiving divine visions. "The children are learning about the great peace," Maria explained, gathering the others around her. "About the mercy that awaits those pure enough to receive it." Johann knelt down to Anna's level, his priest training taking over. Children needed gentleness, needed to feel safe before they would speak honestly. "And what have you learned, little one?" Anna glanced at her mother, then back to Johann. "We're learning to sleep in the boxes Mama made. It's like a game, but it's also practice." She pointed toward the corner of the room, where Johann now noticed 7 wooden boxes, each one sized perfectly for a child's body. His blood turned to ice water in his veins. The boxes were beautifully made, lined with soft white cloth and decorated with carved crosses. They looked like coffins, he whispered, the word escaping before he could stop it. Practice beds, Maria corrected gently. For the great sleep. Heinrich explained it all to me. How the innocent can choose their moment of departure, how a mother's love can guide them home before the world has a chance to steal their light. Johann stood slowly, his mind racing. He had dealt with grief before, had comforted widows who spoke to their dead husbands in dreams. But this was different. This was a mother who had moved beyond grief into something far more dangerous. Mrs. Weissenberg, he said carefully, when did your husband begin speaking to you? The night after the funeral, she replied without hesitation. He was so sad, Father. So worried about leaving us alone in this world of sin and suffering. But then he learned the truth about the mercy that waits for those brave enough to claim it. The children listened to their mother's words with the focused attention of pupils learning a beloved lesson. Friedrich, the eldest, nodded along as if he had heard this explanation many times. Even little Anna seemed to understand concepts that should have been far beyond her years. The world wants to corrupt them, Maria continued, her voice growing stronger. Schools that teach them to question God's word. Friends who will lead them into temptation. Marriage that will tie their souls to earthly pleasures. But there's another path, Father. A path of perfect love. Johann felt sweat gathering on his forehead despite the cold air. And this path involves the practice beds. We practice lying still, Klaus said helpfully, his 9-year-old voice matter of fact. Mama says it will be like the best sleep we've ever had. And when we wake up, we'll be with Papa in the garden where nothing ever hurts. The innocence in the boy's voice was more horrifying than any scream could have been. These children trusted their mother completely, believed in her vision of salvation with the pure faith that only children possessed. They had no idea they were rehearsing their own deaths. Show Father Johann how well you can lie still, Maria suggested, and immediately the children began moving toward their boxes. No, Johann said quickly, his voice sharper than he intended. The children stopped, looking at him with confusion. That is, perhaps later. Right now, I'd like to speak with your mother alone. Maria sent the children upstairs with promises of warm milk later. Though Johann noticed, she said nothing about food. When they were gone, she turned to him with the patient expression of a teacher dealing with a slow student. You think I've lost my mind, she said simply. Johann chose his words carefully. I think you've suffered a terrible loss. And sometimes grief can make us see things that aren't there, hear voices that Heinrich is not a voice in my head, Maria interrupted. He comes to me each night, stands at the foot of our bed, speaks to me of things I never could have imagined on my own. He's learned the truth about love, Father. Real love. The kind that doesn't let go, even when letting go seems kinder. She moved to the window and gazed out at her garden, at the 7 dark rectangles that waited in the earth. Do you have children, Father? No, then you cannot understand. You cannot know what it means to love something so much that you would do anything to keep it safe. Even if the world calls you mad. Even if other mothers turn away in horror. Johann followed her gaze to the garden, and the full horror of her plan became clear. Those weren't just holes in the ground. They were graves, prepared with the loving care of a mother tucking her children into bed. The children seemed to accept this, he said, struggling to keep his voice steady. Children understand love better than adults, Maria replied. They haven't learned to fear it yet. They trust their mother to know what's best, to choose the path that leads to the least suffering. A sound from upstairs made them both look toward the ceiling, the soft thud of small bodies settling into wooden boxes, practicing for the sleep their mother had promised would last forever. The innocence of it, the complete trust, made Johann's chest tight with horror and pity. When, he asked, the question falling from his lips like a stone. Maria smiled, and for a moment she looked like the young mother she had been before grief transformed her into this strange prophet of twisted mercy. Soon, she whispered. Heinrich says the first snow will be the sign. Pure white to cover pure souls. Through the window, Johann could see clouds gathering on the mountains, heavy and gray with the promise of winter's first storm. Time was running out faster than he had imagined, and he found himself caught between his duty as a priest and his growing certainty that words alone would never be enough to save the Weissenberg children. Above them, the house had grown quiet again, and Johann knew that 7 children were lying in darkness, practicing the stillness that their mother believed would carry them to paradise, while outside their windows, the first snowflakes began to fall. November 15th, 1872, the Weissenberg estate snow had been falling for 3 hours when Maria lit the candles in the dining room. 7 flames flickered against the darkness, casting dancing shadows on walls that had witnessed so much joy in years past. Tonight, they would witness something else, something the world would never understand, but which Maria knew with the certainty of prayer was the greatest act of love a mother could perform. The table was set with her finest china, the pieces her mother had given her as a wedding gift. White plates with tiny blue flowers around the edges, delicate as Anna's laugh used to be. 7 plates, 7 cups, 7 napkins folded into perfect squares. Everything had to be perfect for what was coming. In the kitchen, bread rose in the oven, filling the house with the warm smell of yeast and flour. Maria had been baking since dawn, her hands working the dough the way her mother had taught her, the way mothers had done for countless generations. Love lived in the kneading, in the patient waiting for the dough to become something nourishing. Tonight, she would nourish her children one last time. The milk sat in a large pitcher, still warm from the cow that Father Johann had seen in the barn earlier. He had left 3 days ago, promising to return with help, but Maria knew no help would come. The village had already turned away from them. Even God seemed distant now, speaking only through Heinrich's voice in the space between midnight and dawn. "Children," she called softly up the stairs. "Supper." They came down one by one, as they had for so many evenings before. But tonight was different. Tonight, they moved with the careful grace of children who understood that something important was happening, something that required their best behavior and their deepest trust. Anna wore her white Sunday dress, the one with pearl buttons that had belonged to Maria's sister. Friedrich had combed his dark hair back from his forehead, trying to look like the man he would never grow up to be. Each child had chosen their finest clothes without being asked, as if they sensed the occasion called for ceremony. "The table is beautiful, Mama," whispered Margaret, her 8-year-old eyes wide with wonder. The candles reflected in her pupils like tiny stars, and Maria felt her heart break and mend itself all at once. "Tonight is special," Maria said, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "Tonight, Papa is going to join us." The children looked around the room expectantly, and Maria almost believed she could see him too. Heinrich standing in the corner by the window, his face peaceful in a way it had never been during his final fever days. He nodded at her, and she knew it was time. She served them slowly, lovingly. The bread was golden and soft, still warm from the oven. She tore it into pieces with her own hands, the way Christ had done at his Last Supper with the disciples. The milk filled their cups to the brim, white as the snow that continued to fall outside their windows. From the kitchen, she brought a bowl of apples from their own trees, the ones Heinrich had planted when Friedrich was born 14 years ago. The fruit was sweet and crisp, tasting of summer days that felt like memories from another life. Each apple was perfect, unblemished, the way her children had been before the world began to reach for them with its cruel hands. "Tell us a story, Mama," Anna asked, climbing onto her chair and swinging her small legs. "Tell us about the angels." Maria sat down at the head of the table, in Heinrich's chair, and began to speak. Her voice filled the room like music, telling tales of heavenly beings who came to earth to gather the pure in heart, who carried children on wings of light to gardens where no tears were ever shed. The children listened with the focused attention they gave to fairy tales, their eyes bright with trust and wonder. Outside, the wind had begun to howl, driving the snow against the windows like rice thrown at a wedding. The sound was fierce and wild, but inside the dining room, All was warmth and soft voices and the gentle clink of spoons against china. They were finishing their apples when the pounding began. Boom! 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 The front door shook under the force of fists desperate to break through. Father Johann's voice cut through the storm, hoarse from shouting, raw with panic and prayer. "Maria, open the door. Please, in God's name, open the door." The children looked toward the sound, but Maria smiled and continued her story. "The angels came on the night when snow covered the earth like a blanket of stars," she said, her voice rising slightly to cover the priest's pleas. "They came for the children who were ready, who had learned to be still and peaceful and pure. Boom! 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 I have men with me." Johann's voice cracked like breaking ice. "The constable from the village will break down the door." But the door was barred with heavy oak beams, and the windows were shuttered tight. Maria had spent days preparing the house, making it a sanctuary that nothing could breach. Tonight belonged to her and her children and the choice she would make for love. Anna tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mama, someone wants to come in." "I know. My heart," Maria whispered, kissing the top of Anna's golden head. "But tonight is just for us. Tonight is for our family." She stood and began clearing the dishes, her movements calm and deliberate. Each plate, each cup, each piece of silver went back to its proper place. The children helped without being asked, the way they had been taught, the way good children always did. When the table was clean and the candles still burning, Maria opened the kitchen door that led to the garden. Cold air rushed in, bringing with it the smell of snow and earth and the promise of peace that lay beyond all earthly understanding. "Come," she said simply. "It's time." They followed her into the night, 7 children walking behind their mother, like lambs following a shepherd. The snow had covered the 7 dark rectangles in the garden, making them look like sleeping places for angels. Maria had lined each grave with the softest blankets, had placed a small pillow where each head would rest. Anna was first, because she was youngest, because her soul was purest, because the world had barely touched her with its staining hands. She stood at the edge of her grave and looked up at her mother with eyes full of trust. "Will it hurt, Mama?" "Like falling asleep in your own bed," Maria whispered, lifting her youngest child in her arms. "Like the sweetest dreams you've ever had." Anna nodded and closed her eyes. Maria held her tight, feeling the small heartbeat against her chest, memorizing the weight of her child in her arms. Then, gently, she lowered Anna into the soft earth, covering her with blankets and love and promises of paradise. Gretchen went next, then Klaus, then Margaret. Each child trusted completely, lying still as their mother had taught them, closing their eyes and waiting for the dreams to begin. The snow continued to fall, covering their peaceful faces like nature's own blessing. George and Elizabeth stood together, holding hands as the earth received their younger siblings. At 11 and 13, they understood more than the little ones, but their mother's certainty had become their own. If Mama said this was the path to Papa, then this was the path they would take. Friedrich was last, the eldest, the one who had tried so hard to be the man of the house after his father died. He looked at Maria with Heinrich's eyes and said, "Take care of yourself, Mama. We'll be waiting for you." Then he too laid down in the earth that his mother had prepared with such loving care, and Maria covered him with soil and tears and the absolute conviction that she was saving her children from every hurt the world could offer. Behind her, the pounding on the door had stopped. Father Johann's voice had grown hoarse and then silent. The village constable had given up trying to break through walls built to keep the world at bay. In the end, it was just Maria and the falling snow and the 7 small graves that held her heart. She stood in her garden for a long time, listening to the wind and the silence that followed. Heinrich was there beside her, she knew, though she could no longer see his face. He had what he wanted now, his children safe, his family whole, his wife soon to follow. But first, there were letters to write, explanations to leave for those who would come after, and try to understand what love could drive a mother to do. November 18th, 1872, The Weissenberg estate, Father Johann broke through the door on the third morning, when the snow had stopped falling and silence had settled over the house like a shroud. The wood splintered under the axes of the men he had brought from the village, farmers and shopkeepers who had been neighbors to the Weissenbergs, who had watched the children grow from babies into the ghosts that haunted their dreams. The house was cold as a tomb. Their footsteps echoed through rooms where no fires had burned for days, where the smell of baking bread still lingered like a memory of better times. In the dining room, they found the table set with fine china, 7 places arranged with the care of a mother who had wanted everything to be perfect for her children's last meal. Johann moved through the house like a man walking through his own nightmares, checking each room for signs of life he knew he would not find. The children's beds were empty but neatly made. Their clothes hung in wardrobes like the shells of lives that would never be lived. In the corner of the main room, 7 wooden boxes sat waiting, practice coffins that would never be needed now. It was young Klaus Brenner, the blacksmith's son, who found the kitchen door standing open to the garden. Cold air streamed through the opening, carrying with it the scent of fresh earth, and something else that made the men cross themselves and whisper prayers their grandfathers had taught them. "Father," Klaus called, his voice barely above a whisper. "Out here." Johann stepped into the garden and felt his knees give way. 7 small mounds rose from the snow-covered earth, each one marked by a simple wooden cross that Maria must have carved with her own hands. The crosses bore no names, only dates. The day each child had been born, and November 15th, 1872, the day their mother's love had carried them beyond the reach of earthly pain. Maria lay collapsed between the graves of her 2 youngest children, her black dress spread around her like spilled ink on white paper. In her hands, she clutched a letter, the paper worn soft from countless readings, the ink faded but still legible in Heinrich's careful handwriting. Johann knelt beside her and gently took the letter from her frozen fingers. It was dated 3 weeks before Heinrich's death, written during one of his fevered nights when the sickness had made him delirious with pain and the certainty that he was leaving his family defenseless in a cruel world. "My dearest Maria," the letter began, "if God calls me home before our children are grown, promise me you will protect them from the suffering that awaits in this life. Better they should know only love and innocence than live to have their hearts broken by a world that cares nothing for gentle souls. Keep them pure, my beloved. Keep them safe, whatever the cost." The words were those of a dying man, sick with fever and fear, trying to comfort a wife he could not bear to leave behind. But Maria's grief-broken mind had read them as something else, a divine command, a sacred duty, a husband's final wish that she had interpreted with the terrible literalness of madness. Johann folded the letter with hands that shook like leaves in winter wind. Around him, the village men stood silent, their faces pale with the understanding of what they had discovered. Love had done this. Love twisted by loss, guided by grief, shaped by a faith that had turned inward until it became something monstrous and pure. Maria was still breathing, but barely. They carried her down to the village, where Dr. Richter examined her with the careful touch of a man who had seen death in many forms, but never like this. She lived for 2 more days, speaking only Heinrich's name and asking for her children in a voice that broke the hearts of everyone who heard it. She died on November 20th, as the first winter storm howled down from the mountains. Her last words were, "Tell them I'm coming," spoken to empty air with a smile that belonged to a woman seeing angels. The village buried her beside Heinrich in the churchyard, but they could not bring themselves to speak of where her children lay. Some secrets were too dark for the light of common day, too terrible for the comfortable lies that communities tell themselves to sleep peacefully at night. Spring 1873, the abandoned estate, the house burned on a night when the wind blew hard from the east, carrying sparks and ash down into the valley like malevolent snow. No one knew who lit the fire, but everyone understood why it had to be done. Some places hold too much sorrow to stand empty. Some walls remember, too, well, the sounds of children's voices and mothers' prayers and the terrible silence that followed. The flames consumed everything: the fine furniture, the family portraits, the practice coffins, the dining table where 7 children had eaten their last meal. But the fire could not touch the garden. The 7 graves remained, marked by their simple crosses, protected by the strange reverence that even destruction recognizes in the presence of love's final testimony. Years passed, and the crosses weathered and fell. Weeds grew up around the small mounds until they were barely visible among the wild grass and mountain flowers that reclaimed the abandoned estate. The road that led to the house grew over with brambles. Maps stopped showing the estate's location, and then stopped showing the village of Weissenberg itself, as families moved away to places where the wind didn't carry the sound of children singing lullabies on nights when no children lived. But Johann remembered. As the years turned into decades, as his black hair grew gray and then white, as his back bent under the weight of all the prayers he had carried and all the souls he had failed to save, Johann remembered the 7 small crosses and the mother who had loved her children so much that she had buried them with her own hands. October 1902. The forgotten garden father Johann was 78 years old when he made his final journey to the place where the Weissenberg estate had stood. He traveled slowly now, his horse picking its way carefully up the overgrown path that had once been a proper road. In his saddlebags, he carried 7 apples from the orchard behind his parish house, red and sweet and perfect, the way children's laughter used to be. The garden was harder to find now. 30 years of weather and wild growth had softened the harsh edges of grief, had covered the small mounds with a carpet of moss and mountain violets that bloomed purple in the autumn light. But Johann's old eyes could still see the pattern, could still trace the careful arrangement that Maria had planned with such loving precision. He placed 1 apple on each grave, whispering names that no one else remembered: Friedrich, Elizabeth, George, Margaret, Klaus, Gretchen, Anna. 7 children who had trusted their mother completely, who had followed her into the earth believing they were going to meet their father in paradise. The wind stirred the grass around the forgotten graves, and for a moment, just a moment, Johann thought he heard something in its voice. Not words, exactly, but something that might have been laughter, might have been singing, might have been the sound of children playing games in gardens where the flowers never died and mothers never had to choose between love and letting go. He stood there until the sun began to set behind the Austrian mountains, painting the sky the color of apples and forgiveness, and the kind of peace that comes only when all the prayers have been said and all the tears have been shed. As he prepared to leave, Johann noticed something that made him pause. New flowers had begun to grow around each of the 7 mounds. White roses that bloomed out of season, their petals soft as children's skin, their fragrance carrying on the wind like benedictions whispered by voices too pure for earthly ears. Perhaps some forms of love, he thought, were too powerful to be buried, too deep to be forgotten, too true to be judged by the laws of a world that had never learned the terrible mathematics of a mother's heart.